Above the quiet frontier settlement of Haven's Reach, 3 Varen warships hung motionless against the morning sky, their shadows stretching across rooftops that had never once expected to see an alien fleet this close. Inside the colony's small command center, Elias Ward stood with his arms crossed, watching the countdown appear across the communication display in front of him, while on the other end of that channel, Commander Sarah Voss studied him the way a predator studies something that has not yet realized it should be afraid. "You have 1 standard hour to evacuate the settlement," she said. "After that, any structure still occupied will be considered hostile." Elias didn't answer right away. He simply asked whether the evacuation applied to everyone currently under Haven's Reach's protection. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before she replied that all human citizens would be permitted safe passage. It was a careful answer, and Elias understood exactly what it left out. He went very still. Then he asked the only question that seemed to matter. "Are you sure?" Sarah's eyes narrowed, certain she was hearing arrogance from a man with no fleet, no army, and nothing standing between his colony and her warships. She confirmed the ultimatum without hesitation. Elias glanced once at the countdown, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said quietly. "Then I suppose we'd better use the hour." The channel went dark, and somewhere beneath the colony's calm surface, 60 minutes had already begun to matter more than Sarah Voss could possibly imagine. From orbit, Sarah watched the sensor grid update in slow, careful pulses, expecting the familiar pattern of an evacuation: transports lifting toward the outer shuttle lanes, civilians converging on open ground where they could be counted and moved. Instead, the pattern in front of her made no sense at all. Human transports were pulling away from the exposed landing zones instead of filling them. Civilians were disappearing into the colony's lower structures rather than gathering above ground. Heavy cargo equipment was rolling into new positions along the perimeter, as if the colony were bracing for something rather than abandoning it. She opened the channel again, her voice sharper this time. She told Elias it appeared he had misunderstood the terms of the ultimatum, and that nothing she was seeing resembled an evacuation. Elias didn't sound surprised to hear from her. He told her calmly that he understood the terms perfectly. Sarah said nothing for a moment, which told him more than any threat could have. In the command center, Mara Kent had been watching the same readouts with a far less patient expression. She waited until the channel closed before she spoke, and when she did, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years being the one who counted the cost of other people's decisions. She told Elias plainly that they could not save 4,000 people underground by getting every human on the surface killed. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact she needed him to hear out loud. Elias didn't argue with her. He agreed. He told her they weren't going to make that decision for anyone, not for the refugees and not for the colonists either. Whatever happened next, the people of Haven's Reach would decide it themselves, with the truth in front of them, not a version of it filtered through his own conscience. Mara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, already moving toward the comm array to prepare a colony-wide broadcast. Elias remained behind, watching the countdown continue to fall, aware that the next few minutes would decide far more than how the hour ended. Above them, Sarah's sensors finished their sweep of the settlement's lower levels, and the numbers that appeared on her display made her go very still. Beneath the colony, in chambers that had never appeared on any survey she'd been given, nearly 4,000 unidentified life signs were clustered together, waiting in the dark for an hour that was no longer just about the humans above them. Sarah's hand hovered over the display for a moment before she opened the channel again, and this time her voice carried none of the patience it had held before. She told Elias she was looking at nearly 4,000 unregistered life signs beneath his colony, and she wanted to know exactly who they were and why he had chosen to hide them. Elias didn't hesitate. He told her the truth plainly. They were Varen refugees, people who had fled the Directorate's territory months ago and asked Haven's Reach for shelter. "Fugitives," Sarah said, correcting him immediately. "They're fugitives, Administrator. Political instigators the Directorate has been tracking for the better part of a year." "They're civilians," Elias said. "Families, elderly people, children. I've seen their faces. I don't think you have." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue the point further. Instead, she offered him something else, something that from her perspective sounded almost generous. Every human in Haven's Reach could leave safely. She would personally guarantee their passage. All she needed in return was the group sheltering beneath the colony. Elias didn't answer her right away. He told her he needed a moment, and before she could object, he closed the channel and walked out of the command center without a word to anyone waiting inside it. He found Nara in the lower shelter, sitting with a handful of other refugees near a portable heater, her daughter asleep against her shoulder. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression must have told her enough, because she stood before he'd said a single word. "They found us," she said quietly. Elias nodded. He told her about the offer, about safe passage for every human, about what it would cost. Nara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said what he had been afraid she might say. She told him he should take the deal. She said she didn't want a colony full of people who had already given them so much to be destroyed for her sake, or anyone else's. Elias looked at her for a moment before he answered. He reminded her of the first night she'd arrived, exhausted and half convinced they would be turned away before morning. He remembered the question she'd asked him then, the only one that had mattered to her at the time. "How long can we stay?" Nara's eyes glistened because she remembered too. "Until leaving is your choice," Elias said. "That's what I told you. I meant it then. I still mean it now." Nara didn't answer. She simply looked down at her daughter, and Elias understood that some promises didn't need to be argued for. He stood, and for the first time since the ultimatum had arrived, his voice carried something other than calm calculation. It carried the weight of a decision he had already made for himself but refused to make for anyone else. "This isn't just my choice anymore," he said. "It's the colony's." Moments later, every screen and speaker across Haven's Reach came alive at once, carrying his voice into every home, every shelter, every corner of the settlement that had built itself around a promise most of them had never fully understood until now. Elias kept his voice level as it carried across every screen and speaker in Haven's Reach, and he didn't waste time on anything the colony didn't need to hear. He told them plainly what Commander Sarah had offered. Every human could leave safely. She had given her word on it personally. The only condition was that the people sheltering beneath the colony would remain behind. He told them who those people were. Refugees. Families who had asked for nothing more than a place to wait out a danger they hadn't created. He told them he had made a promise to those families, and that the promise had been his to make. "But it isn't mine to force on the rest of you," he said. "Nobody in this colony owes me their life for a decision I made before most of you even knew these people were here. If you want to leave, every ship we have is yours. Mara will get you to it. No one will think less of you for taking it." For a moment, the channel was silent except for the low hum of the colony's systems. Then the responses began one at a time, imperfect and human. A young father near the eastern shelter said he had 2 children and he wasn't going to gamble their lives on a fight that wasn't theirs. Nobody argued with him. Mara herself confirmed his family's place on the next transport without a trace of judgment in her voice. An older woman who ran the colony's water reclamation system said she'd lived through 2 pirate raids and a reactor failure, and she wasn't about to run from something just because it wore a uniform this time. A young medic said she'd stitched up refugee children in the same clinic she'd stitched up colonists, and she didn't see how she was supposed to draw a line between them now. It was a maintenance technician, though, who said the words that seemed to settle over the comm channel longer than the rest. "What exactly does sanctuary mean?" he asked. "If it expires the second somebody threatens us for it?" No one answered him directly. No one needed to. Over the following minutes, the choices came in unevenly, exactly as Elias expected they would. Some families gathered their few belongings and moved toward the waiting transports. Most did not move at all, remaining in the shelters, in their homes, at their stations, quietly choosing to stay without ceremony or speeches. From orbit, Sarah watched the first transports lift away from the surface and allowed herself something close to relief. For a moment, it looked as though Elias had finally made the only sensible choice available to him. Then the numbers stopped climbing far sooner than they should have. She checked the figures twice, certain her instruments had failed her. They hadn't. Only a fraction of the colony's population was aboard those ships. The rest remained exactly where they'd been, beneath a settlement that no longer had any reason to protect anyone but themselves. Sarah opened the channel to Elias one final time, her voice quieter now than it had been all morning, carrying something that sounded almost like genuine confusion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "For people who aren't even human?" Elias didn't take long to answer her. "They asked for help before you asked us to abandon them," he said. Sarah had no response for that, and after a moment she closed the channel without another word. She sat with the silence longer than she wanted to admit, then pulled up the official file on the refugees still sheltering beneath Haven's Reach. She had read it once before departing Varan space, and it had told her everything she thought she needed to know. Political instigators. Destabilizing elements. Individuals connected to unrest that had cost the Directorate dearly in recent months. This time she read it more carefully. The file listed names and family groups rather than individuals, an organizational detail that hadn't caught her attention before. Entire households appeared together on a single line, parents and children recorded under the same designation, the same charge, the same classification. She opened a secondary channel to Haven's Reach, one she hadn't used before, and Nara answered it herself. Sarah didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked bluntly whether Nara could explain why an 8-year-old was listed in directorate records as a security concern. Nara didn't flinch. She said she could because it was her daughter's name on that list, along with the names of children she had personally watched grow up in the same neighborhood the directorate now called a breeding ground for extremists. She sent Sarah something else, records she and the other refugees had carried with them since the night they fled, copies of registration documents showing when and how the classifications had changed. Ordinary residency status 1 month. Security threat designation the next, applied uniformly across entire streets, entire buildings, entire families, with no individual distinctions made at all. Sarah studied the documents for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She told Nara she would need to verify their authenticity before she could accept any of it as fact, and Nara said she understood, because she had expected nothing less. The channel closed, and Sarah sat alone with information that no longer fit as cleanly into the shape she'd been given. The countdown on her display had fallen to 20 minutes. She opened the channel to Elias one final time before the hour ran out, and her voice, when it came, had lost some of the certainty it carried that morning. She repeated her offer, plainly this time without the earlier confidence behind it. Every human aboard safe transport, guaranteed personally. The refugees would remain and whatever followed for them would follow. Elias's answer came without hesitation. I told them they could stay until leaving was their choice, he said. You don't get to make that choice for them. Sarah's composure cracked for just a moment, frustration bleeding through the discipline she usually wore without effort. She told him plainly that if the countdown reached 0, she had orders she would be expected to carry out, whether she wanted to or not. Elias held her gaze through the channel, his voice quiet but unshaken. Then I hope you're sure, he said. The channel went dark and the countdown continued falling toward 0. The countdown continued falling, and beneath its steady progression, Haven's Reach was finally showing what the past hour had actually been used for. Mara moved through the command center coordinating pieces that had been quietly falling into place since the first minutes of the ultimatum. The colony's hardened shelters were sealed and running on independent power, holding civilians who were no longer clustered in any single vulnerable location. Communications had been split across a dozen redundant relays instead of one central array, so that no single strike could silence the settlement or cut it off from the rest of the sector. Survey satellites that normally tracked mineral deposits and weather patterns had been repositioned to flood incoming sensors with clutter, making it far harder for any approaching ship to identify what it was actually looking at. Mining drones, ordinarily used for excavation, had been moved into slow, deliberate patterns along key approach corridors, turning open space into something a warship would have to navigate carefully rather than fly through freely. Cargo tugs had shifted heavy industrial structures into positions that offered cover for the shelters beneath them. None of it was designed to defeat a Varen strike group in open battle. Elias had never believed that was possible, and he'd never pretended otherwise to anyone in the colony. The purpose was different. Every measure existed to make an attack slow, costly, and impossible to disguise as anything other than exactly what it would be, an assault on a civilian settlement sheltering refugees the Directorate wanted erased quietly. Every camera still functioning across Haven's Reach was transmitting continuously, feeding a live signal toward independent relays scattered across neighboring systems. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, it would happen in view of more than just the people standing beneath the fleet. Above the colony, Sarah had finished her own verification, cross-referencing Nara's documents against restricted Directorate archives she still had clearance to access. The registration changes matched exactly. Entire households reclassified overnight, without individual review, without evidence beyond proximity to neighborhoods the Directorate had already decided to condemn. She opened a direct channel to Director Kale, expecting correction, expecting an explanation that would make the discrepancy disappear. Kale's face appeared on her display, calm and entirely unbothered by her report. She told him what she'd found. Families, children, elderly civilians with no connection to any uprising beyond the misfortune of living in the wrong district. Kale's response came without hesitation. Recovery proceeds as ordered, he said. Human casualties are acceptable. Sarah stared at the screen after the connection ended, the words settling over her with a weight she hadn't expected to feel. Elias had told her the truth from the very beginning, and she had spent the better part of an hour refusing to consider that the man threatening to die for strangers might simply be right. The countdown entered its final minutes. Below, Elias watched the same numbers fall, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the console as the settlement around him held its breath. Elias's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the console, a small movement he didn't try to hide from anyone standing near him. His breathing had changed, quieter and more deliberate than usual, the kind of control a person only needed when they were genuinely afraid. He checked the shelter status one final time, confirming every civilian was accounted for, then looked up at the display where the countdown continued its final descent. Whatever calm he had shown Sarah all morning had never come from an absence of fear. It had come from deciding, long before she arrived, exactly what he was and wasn't willing to do about it. Above the colony, Sarah received Cale's final order without argument or hesitation from her own crew. Fire on Haven's Reach. Prioritize the coordinates beneath the settlement. Casualties among the human population were, according to Cale, an acceptable cost of recovery. She gave the command to charge weapons. Across her strike group, targeting systems activated, and for several long seconds it seemed as though she intended to carry the order out exactly as given. Her weapons officer waited, hands steady over the firing controls, watching for the final confirmation. It never came the way he expected. Instead, Sarah redirected the targeting solution entirely, away from the settlement and onto the Directorate surveillance platform and command relay traveling with her strike group, the system Cale had been using to monitor and control the operation remotely. Her weapons officer hesitated, uncertain, and she repeated the order without raising her voice. A precise burst of weapons fire disabled the relay, severing Cale's ability to monitor the operation or issue further commands through it. She made no announcement of loyalty. She gave no declaration of surrender or allegiance. She stated only flatly over her own command channel that she would not carry out an attack built on falsified records against civilians who had done nothing to deserve it. Not every ship in her strike group agreed with her. A small formation of hardline vessels broke away, moving to complete the recovery operation independently, unwilling to accept her refusal as final. Below Haven's Reach's preparations finally mattered. Security craft moved to intercept the breakaway ships, buying time rather than victory. Mining drones drifting along the approach corridors forced the attacking vessels into slower, more careful paths. Sensor clutter from the repositioned satellites made precise targeting difficult even at close range. None of it stopped the hardline ships outright, but it slowed them enough for Sarah's loyal vessels to close the distance and intercept before they could reach firing range on the settlement. The exchange was brief and violent, but it ended with the breakaway ships disabled or forced out of the fight, and Haven's Reach still standing beneath a sky that had nearly turned against it. The countdown reached zero in the middle of the engagement, and nothing struck the colony. For the first time since the ultimatum had arrived, Elias allowed himself to breathe. The relief lasted only briefly before Haven's Reach had to face what came next. Sarah's refusal to carry out Cale's order had not gone unnoticed by the Directorate. Within the hour, a formal channel confirmed what she had already expected. She was declared insubordinate, her command authority revoked, her strike group ordered to stand down and return for review. Return, in practice, meant something closer to arrest than reassignment. Her crew was given a choice of their own. Some remained at her side, unwilling to separate their loyalty to her from the decision she'd made. Others requested neutral detention instead, unwilling to become rebels against the government they had served their entire careers, even if they no longer fully trusted its orders. Sarah didn't argue with either choice. She told her people plainly that she wouldn't hold either decision against them. Elias met her in person for the first time since the ultimatum began, standing across from her in a small room at the edge of the colony's command center. She looked less like a commander now and more like someone still working out what she had actually done. He offered her and her remaining crew temporary shelter under Haven's Reach's protection, the same offer extended to anyone who needed it and had nowhere else to go. Sarah studied him for a moment, something between disbelief and exhaustion crossing her face. "After I threatened your colony?" she asked. "You stopped," Elias said simply. She didn't have an answer for that. Later, Nara found her sitting alone near the same shelter where the refugees had waited out the countdown. Nara didn't offer forgiveness, and she made no attempt to pretend the last few hours hadn't happened. She acknowledged, plainly, that Sarah had refused an order most people in her position would have carried out without question. That was worth something. It didn't erase what had come before it. Sarah accepted this without protest. She seemed, if anything, to expect nothing more than that. The footage and records Haven's Reach had broadcast throughout the confrontation had already begun circulating beyond the colony, reaching neighboring systems and independent observers who had no reason to take the Directorate's account at face value. Questions were being asked in places the Directorate could no longer easily control. It wasn't a collapse. Governments rarely fell in a single afternoon. But the story could no longer be quietly buried, and that for now was enough. Haven's Reach settled into an uneasy calm as the last of the day's tension began to fade, though everyone who had lived through it understood that the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Several weeks passed before Haven's Reach began to feel like itself again, though it was not quite the same colony it had been before the ultimatum arrived. The refugees no longer lived in hidden chambers beneath the settlement. Their presence was known now, documented and acknowledged, and with that acknowledgement had come something none of them expected so quickly. Other worlds, moved by the footage and the evidence that had spread far beyond Haven's Reach, began quietly offering asylum to anyone who wanted it. Some chose to take that offer. Families who had spent months underground packed what little they had and boarded transports bound for places that had never known their names before now, but were willing to learn them. Others chose to stay in Haven's Reach, in the homes and routines they had built during their time in hiding, no longer waiting for permission to belong somewhere. Nara stood near the transport platform one morning, watching a line of families board a ship bound for a world she had never heard of a month earlier. Her daughter stood beside her, watching the same ship with the simple curiosity of a child who understood only that something new was coming. Elias found her there, and for a while neither of them said much. It was Nara who finally spoke. "How long can we stay?" she asked, echoing the question she'd asked him on her first night in Haven's Reach, though there was nothing frightened in her voice this time. Elias smiled slightly. "Until leaving is your choice." Nara looked back at the ship, at the families choosing new worlds for reasons that were entirely their own now, free of fear, free of hiding. "I think some of us are finally ready," she said. Elias didn't argue with that. He simply nodded, understanding that this too was part of what the promise had always meant. Sarah's departure came a few days later, quieter than her arrival had been. She wasn't returning to a command or a government that would welcome her back easily. Independent investigators from several neighboring systems had already reached out, interested in what she knew about the Directorate's internal orders, and she had agreed to speak with them. It wasn't redemption, not exactly. It was simply the next right thing in front of her, and she seemed willing to keep choosing those one at a time. Before she left, she asked Elias the question that had stayed with her since the moment the ultimatum began. "That first day," she said, "when I gave the order to evacuate and you asked if I was sure. What did you actually mean by that?" Elias considered the question for a moment before answering. "I wasn't asking if you were sure you could destroy this colony," he said. "I already knew you could. I was asking if you were sure you wanted to become the kind of person who would." Sarah had no response to that, though something in her expression suggested she finally understood the question fully for the first time. She left Haven's Reach that afternoon, her ship rising slowly past the same sky that had once carried 3 warships and an ultimatum. Below, the colony continued on, quieter now but steadier, having held a line long enough for someone on the other side of it to see clearly what crossing it would have meant. Elias watched her ship disappear into the distance, then turned back toward the settlement that had, in the end, chosen exactly what it wanted to protect.